Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are diving into, well, you could say a pretty deep concept, a real philosophical cornerstone even. Truthmakers.
Yes, truthmakers.
And you, as a philosopher, of course, you pointed us towards some really fascinating entries in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this very subject.
That's a good one. A classic.
And well, we're going to try to unpack what truthmakers are, explore why philosophers care so much about them, and navigate the key debates surrounding this concept. It's going to be a wild ride. Think of this as your express lane to a really central discussion in, contemporary metaphysics, but for philosophers,
Yeah, right. I think for anyone with a philosophical background, this deep dive should offer like a really focused reexamination of some of the really big questions.
Yeah.
About the nature of truth and reality, the kinds of things philosophers love.
Right. The big ones.
We'll be dissecting all these different attempts to, try to articulate what ultimately grounds our true statements, paying close attention to like the logical structures and conceptual frameworks that are kind of underpinning all of these theories.
Oh yeah, we're getting into the nitty-gritty.
We'll be looking at how all these, how different philosophical perspectives grapple with this idea that truths are, in a sense, made true by something in the world.
Yeah, in a sense, made true.
Made true.
Okay, well, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry you shared is it's quite a resource.
It is, yeah.
A really comprehensive lay of the land, truthmaker theory.
That's great.
Mapping out all the different approaches philosophers have taken, the motivations driving their inquiry, and crucially all the persistent challenges and criticisms that have emerged.
Right, yeah. It really does a good job of laying out the whole landscape.
Yeah, and we're going to be drawing on various sections from the really foundational definitions of truthmakers to the spectrum of, the proposed relationships, including entailment, necessitation, and grounding. We'll look at the big question of which truths even need truthmakers in the first place.
What's the million-dollar question?
The terrain of maximalism versus optimalism.
Oh, exactly.
Right, and try to get a sense of, what are the real philosophical impulses behind this entire field of investigation?
Driving forces, yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's just jump right in. What constitutes a truthmaker?
Right to the heart of it.
Right to it. Okay, so the encyclopedia starts with a definition, and it feels pretty straightforward, pretty direct. A truthmaker is that in virtue of which something is true. As a philosopher, you immediately recognize the work that needs to be done, right?
Yeah, right off the bat, you see in virtue of which, and you're like, oh boy, here we go.
Right. Okay. But the text quickly clarifies that this isn't a causal kind of making in the everyday sense, like, a sculptor creating a statue.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not about like the potter in the pot,
It's not the potter in the pot. It's not about how the thing came to be.
Exactly. We're not interested in like the causal history leading to a belief or statement.
Right.
The making here it's like a more fundamental, like a deeper, a metaphysical relationship of grounding or dependence. And the encyclopedia even introduces this notion of a minimal truthmaker.
A minimal truthmaker. Okay.
So this is a truthmaker that doesn't contain any extraneous parts that could kind of do the truth-making work on their own. It's like the bare minimum needed to make the truth true.
Just the essentials.
Exactly.
Okay. But this whole idea, a single truth might have multiple truth makers, either acting individually or kind of working together in some way. That's a big one, too.
Oh, yeah. That's a really important point. It's not always a one-to-one relationship.
No, not at all. Okay. So this brings us to the real philosophical meat, right? In virtue of... and the encyclopedia notes that some people argue that it's a primitive concept, like something we have to accept as basic.
Right. It's like, look, this is as fundamental as it gets. We can't break it down any further.
Right. But, philosophers, naturally, they want to analyze it, right?
Of course. You can't just tell a philosopher that's just how it is.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to want to dig deeper.
Right. Always digging deeper. Okay. So how have philosophers tried to make sense of this in virtue of this fundamental relationship, beyond just the basic definition?
Right. Well, one of the earliest attempts, and it kind of makes sense, right, involves understanding truth-making through the lens of, entailment.
Entailment, okay.
The idea here is that a truth-maker is something whose very existence, just the fact that it is, entails the truth of a particular statement. Yeah. So The appeal of this approach, as the encyclopedia points out, is that entailment is something we're familiar with. I mean, it's everywhere in philosophy, in logic, even in like everyday reasoning, or across different academic disciplines. It's a concept with like a wide scope.
Right. It's a pretty solid, logical candidate for explaining this kind of connection.
It seems like it should work, right?
Right. But the encyclopedia pretty quickly throws a wrench in the works, right? It introduces this challenge, the problem of overgeneration, particularly with necessary truths, like 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Oh, yeah, the classic 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Right. So how does that problem come up?
Okay, so in classical logic, right, a necessary truth, like 2 plus 2 equals 4,
Yeah.
is entailed by, well, basically any proposition whatsoever.
Oh, interesting. So anything can entail a necessary truth.
Yeah, that's the thing. So if we say that a truth maker is something whose existence entails a truth, well, then suddenly the mere fact that there's, leftover veggies in your fridge, that technically entails that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
What? Yeah. My leftover veggies in my fridge are affecting the laws of mathematics.
That's what the theory seems to be saying.
Okay.
So if we then take the existence of those leftovers as a truth maker, we end up with this really weird conclusion. The stuff in your refrigerator is making mathematical truths true, which, kind of violates any intuitive principle of relevance, right?
Yeah, that seems way off. I mean, I like to think that, my week-old salad isn't messing with arithmetic.
I think we can all agree on that one.
Right. Okay, and this gets even weirder. The encyclopedia talks about Restall's argument. That leads to truthmaker monism, this idea that every truthmaker makes every truth true. I mean, how does that happen?
Right, Brestol's argument. Oh, that's a fun one. It's like a real head scratcher. It shows you just how slippery this whole entailment thing can get. Okay, so he starts with this, basic logical truth. Like for any proposition P, either P is true or not P is true. P or not P. It's like a tautology, right? Can't go wrong. Now, according to this entailment view of truth makers, right, any existing thing, like literally anything, qualifies as a truth maker for this, this necessary disjunction.
Okay, so anything can be a truth maker for a tautology.
Right. Now, Ristall brings in this thing called the disjunction thesis.
The disjunction thesis, okay.
And this says that if something makes a disjunction true, it does so by making at least one of the things in the disjunction, the disjuncts, true. So let's say we've got an ice floe in Antarctica,
right,
just chilling there.
Just hanging out.
And it's a truth maker for this proposition. Grass is green or grass is not green.
Okay, so the ice floe is making that statement true.
Right. Now, according to the disjunction thesis, that ice floe has to be making either grass is green true or grass is not green true.
It's got to be one or the other.
Right. Now, let's say grass is green is actually true.
Well, yeah, grass is green.
Right. So the ice floe can't be making grass is not green true because, well, grass is green.
Right, because that would be a contradiction.
Exactly. So the ice floe must be making grass is green true. But here's the crazy part. We just pick the ice floe and grass is green randomly.
So it could be anything.
Right. The argument suggests that because we could have chosen any random thing and any random true statement, every truth maker ends up making every truth true.
Whoa, hold on. So like a pebble on the beach is making the statement, Plato was a philosopher, true.
That's what Restall's argument seems to be saying. It's wild.
That's a big problem.
Yeah, it really throws a wrench in the whole entailment thing.
Okay, this leads us to this idea of relevance. The idea that a truth maker for a truth should be in some way what that truth is about. It feels right,
Right, it just makes sense. It's like intuitively we know that the truth of a mathematical equation isn't grounded in the fact that there's, a half-eaten sandwich in my fridge.
Right, your sandwich is not making mathematical truths true.
No, it's not. But as the encyclopedia points out, defining aboutness and relevance in a rigorous way is really, really hard. Philosophers have been struggling with that one for a long time.
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack.
We can know that a statement is true without having total knowledge of its underlying truth maker. And the truth maker itself might be way more complex than the statement it's grounding, but still we have this strong intuition that there has to be some kind of connection, right?
Right. Some kind of connection. And it can't just be anything.
Exactly. And this whole conflict between, just applying entailment T willy-nilly and this principle of relevance, it really shows that we need a more refined, a more nuanced account of truth-making.
Yeah, okay. And the encyclopedia touches on various attempts to kind of, save the entailment approach, like, changing the disjunction thesis or using a more restricted idea of relevant entailment.
Right. There are all these different tweaks and adjustments you can make.
Right. But it seems like there's a deeper problem with defining truth making as entailment, isn't there?
Yeah, and this is why a lot of philosophers have moved on to other frameworks. I mean, the whole point of this Truthmaker program is to find a solid link between truth and reality, right? It's to say that our true statements are grounded in something real, something that's not just another representation.
Right, some actual thing in the world.
Exactly. But entailment, at its core, it's a relationship between representations, between, propositions or sentences.
Okay.
So no matter how much we tinker with our understanding of entailment, we're always going to be left with this question. How are these representations of the truth maker connected to the real world? How do they actually hook onto reality?
Makes sense. Okay, so entailment is out. What's next?
Well, the encyclopedia then brings up truth making as necessitation.
Necessitation. Okay.
Another one of those modal concepts. So the idea here, it builds on this recognition that, okay, entailment has its limits. It's not quite cutting it.
It's not doing the job.
Right. So Armstrong, he proposed this primitive relation of metaphysical necessitation.
Okay, a primitive relation of metaphysical necessitation.
Yeah, a mouthful, I know.
Hmm.
But the basic idea is a truth maker is something that necessitates the truth of a particular statement.
It makes it so that the statement has to be true.
Right. Like there's no other way the world could be. If the truth maker exists, then the statement must be true. And this move, it's trying to avoid this whole category mistake of relating representations like entailment does. It's connecting truth making to these other modal concepts that philosophers are comfortable with.
Right, it's bringing in the heavy hitters. Okay, but Armstrong argued for this view by saying that if something doesn't necessitate a truth, well, then it just doesn't seem like enough. Like it needs something else, some extra oomph to really be a truth maker. And conversely, if something does necessitate a truth, well, then it seems like it must be the truth maker.
Right.
But the encyclopedia points out a bit of a snag.
Oh, yeah. The encyclopedia is always good for pointing out the snags.
Right. Always keeping us honest.
Right. So the problem is, it looks like Armstrong's argument might be a bit, circular. It's kind of assuming what it's trying to prove.
Oh, the classic circularity problem.
Right. It's basically saying, look, only a relation of necessitation can really ground truth-making. And that's because only necessitation can really ground truth-making. It's not giving us any independent reason to think that necessitation T is the right way to go.
It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And, just like the entailment approach, the necessitation account runs into this problem of overgeneration. If almost anything can be said to necessitate a necessary truth, well, we're back to ice flows making mathematical statements true. So just swapping out entailment for necessitation doesn't magically solve the relevance problem.
Nope, not at all. It's like putting a new coat of paint on an old rusty car. It looks a bit better on the surface, but the underlying problems are still there.
Right. Still a clunker.
And Armstrong really needed to flesh out this cross-categorial necessitation relation in a way that would rule out those kinds of, intuitively irrelevant cases.
Yeah, he needed to give us some criteria, some way to tell the good truth makers from the bad.
Exactly. And then, of course, the encyclopedia brings up Smith's famous counterexample with the will of God.
Oh, yeah, the divine will problem.
Right. So the objection is God willing something to be true, God could, make a proposition true just by wanting it to be so.
Right. God's will is pretty powerful.
Right. But that act of divine willing, it doesn't really feel like the right kind of truth maker, right? It doesn't feel like it's grounding the truth in the way we're looking for.
Yeah, there's something weird about saying that God's will is the truth maker for like, the sky is blue.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, but what about the actual physical sky? What about the light scattering and all that?
Right, exactly. It feels like it's missing the actual, wordly connection we're after.
Right.
So it seems like necessitation, it might be a necessary condition for truth making. Maybe a truth maker has to necessitate the truth, but it might not be enough on its own.
It might not be the whole story.
Right. And Smith, he tried to refine the definition by bringing in this concept of projection.
Projection, okay.
And it's supposed to capture the subject matter of a truth bearer. what the statement is actually about.
Okay, so like if a statement is about cats, its projection would be the set of all cats or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And his idea was that a real truth maker, it not only has to necessitate the truth, but it also has to fall within the projection of the statement. Like it has to be relevant to what the statement is actually about.
Okay, that makes sense. Keeps things nice and tidy.
Right. But, as the encyclopedia points out, defining this whole projection thing in a way that's not circular, without using concepts that are just as messy as truth making itself, that's a real challenge.
Yeah, we don't want to be defining one mystery with another mystery.
Exactly.
And then there's Ace, right? And he just goes ahead and accepts these seemingly irrelevant truth makers. He just bites the bullet.
Well, Ose, he loves to stir the pot. He's like, you know what? Maybe truth making's just weird. Maybe it doesn't have to be all neat and tidy.
So he's saying, like, yeah, maybe my sandwich is making mathematical truths true.
Basically, yeah. He argues that truth making is, it's a technical term. It's this tool within metaphysics, and that mathematical truths, they have these kind of trivial objects like, numbers.
Right. Okay.
And they have equally trivial truth makers. It's like, it's just how it is, folks. Get used to it.
A bold move.
Oh, yeah. But as you can imagine, it comes with, some pretty heavy baggage. The encyclopedia lays out a couple of major issues. First, Assay's whole introduction of truth making, it relies on this informal thought experiment, which kind of undermines this whole idea that it's just this technical term, divorced from intuition.
Right. It's not as clean cut as he makes it seem.
Exactly. And then there's the whole claim that mathematics is just analytic or trivial. That's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, that's a debate for another day, probably.
Oh yeah. Philosophers have been arguing about that one for centuries. So, to build your whole theory of truth makers on that, it makes you wonder, how sturdy the foundation really is.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to the necessitation T framework. The encyclopedia brings up this interesting point about the nature of truth bearers, the things that are made true.
Right. What are the things that are getting made true?
Exactly. And Armstrong seems to like this idea of an internal necessitation relation, where the truth bearers themselves, just by existing, entail this relation holding between them and their truth makers.
Like it's baked into their very essence.
Right. So this would seem to mean that, truth bearers have to be these self-interpreting propositions.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong requirement.
So if this truth-making relation is internal, in this specific way that Armstrong is talking about, then only entities whose very being, includes their content, their meaning, could really be truth bearers.
Right. Because if something could have had a different meaning, then it's not like that meaning is essential to it, It could have been different.
Okay, that makes sense. But this creates a kind of a tension with Armstrong's overall commitment to naturalism.
Oh, yeah, big time. I mean, naturalism's all about, sticking to the natural world, the things we can observe and measure.
Right. The things we can study scientifically.
Exactly. And, as the encyclopedia points out, naturalism makes you pretty wary of this whole realm of, abstract propositions floating around out there.
Right. Like these propositions, they're not physical things.
Right. They're not like rocks or trees or even brains. They're abstract entities. And a lot of naturalists are like, look, I don't know about all that. That seems a bit spooky.
A bit too metaphysical.
Exactly.
Okay, so if Armstrong is a naturalist, what does he think truth bearers are?
Well, he kind of wants to say the truth bearers are these concrete token beliefs and thoughts, things that actually happen in brains.
Okay, those seem more naturalistic, but they don't really fit with this whole internal relation thing, do they?
Not really. I mean, a particular belief or a thought, it could have had a different meaning, right? I could have believed that the sky is green, even though it's not.
Right, so the meaning of that belief isn't really essential to it.
Exactly. So it's not clear how you'd get this internal relation of necessitation between, a concrete belief in my brain and the actual truth maker out there in the world.
It's starting to feel like this whole internal relation idea is causing more problems than it's solving.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a sticky wicket.
Okay, so we've got this tension between Armstrong's internal relation and his naturalism. And it seems like it would be really, really hard to come up with a naturalistic kind of representation that's inherently internally connected to its truth maker. This kind of points towards, the truth-making relation being external.
Right. If we're skeptical of these abstract propositions, which, a lot of naturalists are, then we should also be skeptical of this idea that truth-making is internal. It's like if the thing that's being made true could have been about something else, then how can its meaning be essential to the truth-making relation?
Okay, that makes sense. So Mulligan and Lowe, they come along and they propose this essentialist approach.
A new contender enters the ring.
Right. So they say that a truth maker for a proposition is, well, it's something that's part of the very essence of that proposition.
It's like it's what makes that proposition, and not some other proposition.
Okay, so the proposition would be true if and only if that specific thing exists.
Right. It's built right into the core of the proposition.
Okay. And this seems like it could, it could get around some of those weird cases we were talking about.
Right. Like, God's will or an ice flow,
Mm-hmm.
they're not part of the essence of like a mathematical proposition, right?
Right. They're not baked into the concept of 2 + 2 = 4.
Exactly. But the encyclopedia brings up a good point. Yeah, do we really have a clear grasp of this whole essence of a proposition thing?
Right. Is that any less mysterious than truth makers themselves?
And this view also says that there's this internal relation between a proposition and its truth maker.
Right.
So it inherits some of the same problems that we saw with necessitation T.
Okay, so we're still kind of stuck.
Yeah, it seems like we might need a different approach altogether. Maybe we're going about this the wrong way.
Maybe we are.
Yeah.
So this leads us to this idea of axiomatic truth-making. And the encyclopedia uses this analogy with knowledge. Like we might not be able to define what knowledge is perfectly, but we can still understand it by seeing how it's connected to other things.
Right. Like we know the knowledge has to be true, that you have to believe it, and that you have to have good reasons for believing it, even if we can't perfectly define what good reasons are,
Right. So maybe we can do something similar with truth makers.
That's the idea. So instead of trying to like reduce truth making to something else, something more basic, we could introduce it through this system of principles.
Okay, like axioms.
Right, axioms. And these axioms would lay out how truth making is connected to these other core concepts like existence, entailment, and factivity.
Okay, so we're building a framework rather than a foundation.
Exactly. And, these principles, they would give us this working understanding of what truth-making is without having to rely on a reductive definition.
So what kind of principles are we talking about?
Well, there are a few key ones. There's the factive principle, which is, basically if A makes P true, then P is true. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
Right. Then there's the existence principle. If A exists, then A makes it true that A exists.
Okay, so things make their own existence true.
Right. And then there's the entailment principle. If A makes P true and P entails Q, then A makes Q true.
Okay, so if something makes a statement true, it also makes all the things that follow from that statement true.
Right. And together, these principles, they give us this web of connections that help us understand how truth-making works.
It's like a network of relationships.
Exactly. But, even with this axiomatic approach, we don't completely escape the overgeneration problem, do we?
Oh, no, that pesky overgeneration problem. So even with axioms, we still have to deal with ice flows making mathematical truths true.
Yeah, because if truth-making is defined in a way that follows classical entailment, well then, if something makes a contingent statement true, it's also going to make any necessary truth true. It all comes back to, to relevance.
Right. And we still don't have a perfect handle on that one.
Not quite. So even with this axiomatic approach, we still need to think carefully about, what kind of entailment we're talking about. It's probably going to have to be a more restricted and non-classical kind of entailment.
Okay, so we're getting into the weeds of logic here.
A little bit, yeah. But that's philosophy for you.
Okay, but this axiomatic approach, it does have some things going for it, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The encyclopedia points out that it doesn't require the truth bearer and the truth maker to be, internally related.
Right, which sidesteps a lot of the headaches we were having before.
Exactly. And it seems like it's taking a less metaphysically loaded stance.
Right. It's not trying to tell us what the ultimate furniture of reality is, It's just trying to give us this framework for understanding how truth-making works without taking sides in these big ontological debates.
Okay, so it's a bit more neutral.
Exactly. It's like, look, here's a way to think about truth-making.
Yeah.
You can plug in your favorite metaphysics, whatever that may be.
Okay, I like it. A good, flexible system.
Right.
Okay, and finally we've got truth-making as grounding. And this one seems to fit with the recent interest in metaphysical dependence, this idea that things in the world depend on each other in all these different ways.
Oh, yeah. Grounding is all the rage these days. It's the new kid on the block.
Right. So how does truth-making fit into that?
Okay, so the basic idea is that we're going to use this concept of grounding to try to explain what it means for something to make a truth true.
Yeah, okay.
And grounding, it's basically it's this form of, non-causal dependence. It's like saying that one thing depends on another thing for its existence or its nature, but not in a, in a cause and effect kind of way.
Right. It's a deeper kind of dependence.
Exactly. So we're basically trying to provide a more detailed account of this, this in virtue of relation that we started with.
Okay, so we're going back to the beginning, but with new tools.
Exactly. And the hope is that by understanding truth-making as a specific kind of grounding, we can get this richer, more unified view of both concepts.
It's all coming together.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Okay, but the encyclopedia gives us two main ways of formulating this grounding approach. One with a grounding predicate and one with a grounding operator. It gets a bit technical.
Yeah, it gets into the nitty-gritty of logic again.
But it seems like no matter how you slice it, these grounding-based accounts, they still run into those familiar problems, like needing propositions that are hyper-intentionally related to their truth makers.
Right, because grounding is supposed to be this really fine-grained relation. Like it can tell the difference between the grounds of, necessary truths and contingent truths.
Okay.
And to do that, it often has to operate over propositions that have their meanings, essentially. Like the meaning is built right in.
Okay.
So if a proposition is grounded in something, well, then it has to keep that same meaning across all the different possible worlds where both the proposition and the grounding thing exist.
Okay, so the meaning can't change depending on which possible world you're in.
Right. And this can be tricky.